Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
They stood close together, a scattered group caught in uncertainty like a lost flock of sheep. Chaos and confusion filled the air. Emily winced under the harsh glare of the lights, feeling as if they cut straight through her skull. Onlookers murmured and asked questions, but she ignored them. She hadn't even moved into the apartment yet, and the only person she'd met was the manager. To everyone there, she was just another bystander. She stared at the smoldering remains of the place she had planned to call home, an empty feeling settling in her chest. Everything she owned, what little she had left, was inside waiting for her. The divorce had already taken so much. She couldn't afford to lose more. Each item she had carefully chosen to fit her new life, each piece a reflection of who she was. And yet, none of it mattered except for that one container in the closet. She didn't stop to think before she broke away from the crowd. Determination pushed her forward as she weaved around hoses and piles of rubble. The world seemed to freeze around her, the noise of the night fading into silence as she ran up the sidewalk. Nathan Carter sat on the bumper of the fire truck, exhaustion weighing down every muscle. He cradled a bottle of water, taking a final swig as he surveyed the aftermath. Several crews had battled the raging fire for hours, and now all that remained were steaming piles of debris. As he wiped sweat from his brow, he caught sight of movement, a figure slipping toward the wreckage. "Hey, you can't go in there," he shouted, but the woman didn't stop. Emily rushed through the darkened gap where the front door had once been, her heart pounding. The acrid stench of smoke and charred wood filled her lungs, but she pressed on. "Stop. Don't go any further," Nathan called, picking his way through the wreckage. His gear felt heavier with each step, sweat dripping from his face. He watched as she maneuvered through the debris with surprising agility, her movements almost effortless. She must be an athlete, he thought, though he didn't yet realize that it wasn't skill carrying her forward, it was sheer, unrelenting determination. The oppressive heat and dread began to slow Emily down. Her apartment door had a gaping hole in it and leaned at an awkward angle. Water covered the floor and dripped down the walls. As she took a step inside to retrieve her most prized possession, she knew right where it was, too. Another minute and she'd be out of there again. "Didn't you hear me back there?" Nathan asked as he grabbed her arm. "It's too dangerous for anyone to be in here. You don't understand. I have to get it," she said as she tried to pull free. "We're leaving before this place collapses on us." She broke loose of his grip and ran into her bedroom. Part of the ceiling blocked her way to the closet, but she ducked under it and crawled the last few feet. The container sat in the corner, covered with insulation and plaster. Emily pulled it to her just as she felt a tug on her legs. "Let go." She heard the urgency in his voice and paused at the reality of their situation. Her pant leg was caught on something, stopping her progress back to where he waited in anger and trepidation. Her hands shook as she worked the container loose and stood up to face him. Nathan shoved her ahead of him a few feet at a time, back through her apartment and into the hallway. Worry masked the exhaustion on his face. Emily noticed the sounds this time. Water trickled down what was left of the walls and dripped from the ceiling. Piles of boards and belongings hissed from the heat buried within. Voices from outside echoed as if in a faraway canister. Her legs buckled at the sheer destruction the fire had left behind. An odd haze of smoke and steam clouded the air, filling her lungs as she tried to breathe. "This way," Nathan said, pointing to her right. She followed his lead this time as he stepped over and around beams and braces. Later, she would wonder how she'd ever made it to her apartment in the first place. Emily clutched the container to her chest and trudged on. Breathing became difficult, and her feet felt like a ton each. She saw the fading figure in front of her disappear as her vision clouded, and she fell to her knees. The sudden shifting in the floor brought a scream from deep in her throat. Nathan felt the movement and knew in his gut they were in trouble. 10 seconds was all he needed to get them to safety. 2 was all he had before chaos erupted. Every instinct in him screamed to grab the girl, but she was nowhere in sight. An explosion shook the building with such force that it brought the remainder of the roof down. The floor opened, and a giant cavern sucked him in. Nathan felt himself tumbling through the emptiness and wondered if this was how he was going to die. Boards crashed into his arms and legs until he felt numb. As he landed at an awkward angle in the hollowed-out space, his last thought was of the girl as parts of the floor above him covered his injured body. Emily felt the crushing weight of debris above her and thought she was going to die. The space had an eerie silence to it, so opposite the resounding echoes of the explosion just moments ago. Her breathing escalated as she went over the moments before the blast in her mind. She feared for the firefighter's safety but tried to convince herself he made it out all right. It would all be her fault if he died or suffered any injuries. Emily knew he'd been several feet ahead of her when the building blew up. That little bit of encouragement was all she needed to imagine the man making it out to the yard. Her own death wouldn't be a great loss to the world anyway, she decided. Her vision blurred from the combination of the tears gathering in them and the dust in the air. She tried to move her left arm, but only her fingers had space to wiggle. A slight shifting in the beam made her heart beat out of control. The reality of her situation slammed into her in that second. This wasn't television with happy endings for everyone. A terrified scream threatened to erupt from her throat. Instead, Emily coughed and choked from the grittiness clogging its way. Panic made her kick out at anything she could in the blackness surrounding her. A searing pain in her right knee stopped any further movement for several minutes. She moved everything slower this time. Emily felt around in the tiny space with her right arm until she hit something solid. It shocked her to recognize that the precious container was still with her. Knowing it was safe comforted Emily as she passed out amidst the rubble a moment later. The explosion had firefighters scrambling for safety. Hoses and equipment littered the yard as dust and smoke filled the sky above what remained of the apartment building. Only seconds passed before they turned back and began their job once more. Jason felt the energy flowing from all the crews called to fight this place. The latest blast shook the ground and crumbled more of the ruined structure. This new development frightened the onlookers so much that some of them screamed and moved further away. Several of the tenants stood speechless as they tried to comprehend what was happening. Local news stations fought to get quotes from anyone associated with the fire. "Stand back, everyone," the young firefighter commanded. "You need to stay out of the way, people." Jason worked at keeping the growing number of interested reporters and worried family members back from danger. Hours on the job made him hot and tired, but he kept his irritation at bay. It always amazed Jason the way fires brought out the ignorance in some people. "Can you tell us was this arson? Is there a suspect?" Arms thrust microphones toward him, spitting out questions. Jason just shook his head and ignored them all. He didn't have any answers, but it wasn't his job to talk to the press either. This was his third year on the force in Ridgeway, and he loved what he did except for when he had to do crowd control, that was. He didn't argue, though, since it was all part of it. He'd wanted to be a fireman ever since third grade when the captain of the local station gave their class a speech on safety. His parents had just chuckled at first and figured it was a phase. Jason later became intrigued with the patterns left behind in the destruction. His goal was to become part of the investigation team that worked in this area. Alarms rang in his head that this fire would be the cause of more despair than just lost belongings. Emily tried to distinguish the sounds that exploded in her head as she came to. She opened her eyes but saw nothing except blackness. Panic gripped her entire being at the frightening thought of not being able to see. Nausea threatened to fill her throat as she tried to scream, yet only a silent whimper came out. Muted voices broke into her terror at the same time the overpowering stench of the fire filled her nostrils. Everything came back to her in an instant, including the explosion. Emily remembered then that the crashing ceiling and walls had collapsed around her. The damp air sent chills over her skin as she worked at calming herself. A deep breath sent a stabbing pain through her chest like none she'd ever felt before. She waited until the worst was over and thought back to when she ran into the building. Her apartment was on the first floor, but that didn't mean she was there now. It was possible she'd fallen several feet when the blast hit. "Rescue personnel would be looking for both of us," she whispered. "It's their job." All she had to do was make some noise when she heard them get closer to wherever she was. Emily forced herself to relax as she envisioned the sunshine on her face once more. She lost consciousness to the sounds of water dripping next to her. He was too tired for work, Nathan thought. His body ached everywhere, and the headache pounding in his skull almost made him vomit. The natural inclination to get up only brought a spewing of bile from him. He stopped to take a breath, and the rancid odor of the fire brought it all back to him. Nathan saw the girl running into the building in his mind and worried what happened to her. The gear he still wore gave him some protection, but she only had jeans and a thin shirt on. Nathan knew without a doubt he was in deep trouble here. He could feel both of his legs bent at an odd angle under a crushing weight. The last seconds before the explosion played back in his mind as he tried to get an idea of where he might have landed. He remembered a stairwell leading up on his left as they'd stumbled through toward an exit. The crew would find him. They would notice his absence and do a complete search. Nathan had no doubt of that. He worked with an amazing group and had faith in them. His breathing slowed as he went through the steps in his head that they would take to rescue him. That was his last thought as he drifted into oblivion once more. An outsider would see chaos, but anyone working the fire knew it was anything but. There were trained teams assigned to oversee every task. Nathan and Ethan went to the academy together and became good friends. A desire to be the best they could in their chosen field spurred them on. They became competitive but never resented each other. Ethan applied for a position in his hometown of Ridgeway and encouraged Nathan to do the same. He'd hesitated since it meant a move of several hours away if he was accepted. That decision became easier for Nathan to make when his girlfriend of 2 years broke up with him. Their outstanding grades and enthusiasm paid off when the city offered both young men a job. Nathan fit right in with Ethan's family and friends. They worked hard on the job and filled their time off with ball games, concerts, and finding dates. That changed when Ethan met Sarah. She worked at a major bank in the state and transferred to the local branch. Ethan walked in to take care of his paycheck and left with her telephone number. It didn't take long before Sarah was trying to set Nathan up with every coworker and friend she had. She adored him and wanted him to be as happy as she and Ethan were. Most of the men at the station had fought fires when Ethan and Nathan were still babies. Some may have resented the newcomers with their fresh attitude, but that wasn't the case with the crew from Ridgeway. Knowledge didn't match experience, but each had a place. They all looked out for each other and never forgot the danger of the flame. "Something's wrong with Nathan," Ethan said as he sprinted over to the captain. "He's not responding to any radio calls." The entire crew respected Captain Joseph Reed, despite his gruff demeanor. He'd been a firefighter for over 20 years and loved what he did. Ethan watched as the man snapped into action. Repeated demands over his radio for Nathan to report in went unanswered. He ordered several of his men to his side and set up a search team within minutes. A check of the perimeter came back with a negative report. Dread and worry lined the faces of the entire group awaiting further instructions. "Who saw him last?" Joseph asked. "He yelled something and went to the truck," one of the men said. "I was there when he grabbed some water. He nodded everything was fine when I asked him." Another spoke up. "That doesn't explain why he might go back into that building when it wasn't safe to enter." I made the call and repeated it several times over the radio. Joseph knew that Nathan followed orders probably better than anyone did on his crew. No one saw Nathan enter the building, so the questions were numerous. He wasn't anywhere outside on the scene, which meant he had to be inside. They decided on his possible point of entry and the first team headed in. Joseph stood helpless with his men as they reported their movements in a dangerous structure. A heavy rope kept the well-trained men together as they searched the section assigned to them. Precious minutes passed with no news. "It's taking too long," Ethan said. "We'll find him, Ethan." Joseph rested his hand on the younger man's shoulder to reassure him, even though he himself felt a sense of unease. Too much time kept slipping away. Joseph's radio crackled and a shout came through. "We see him." Ethan sagged with relief as the other firefighters cheered. They all listened for a further report from the team that discovered Nathan. Paramedics waited to whisk him away. Later they could discover why he was in there. Right now, they needed to get him out. "Captain, we'll need some heavy-duty equipment in here. There's about 3 feet of beams and debris on top of him where he landed in the basement. It's just a miracle Tom spotted his arm the way he's buried in there." Each word took some of the hope from the crew. They knew the risks of their job and the chances of surviving if caught in an explosion. Walls and floors tumbled down like straws but weighed tons. One wrong move and the remaining pieces could crush anything in their way. Men moved at a rapid pace as Joseph spat out orders. Equipment appeared and more people stood by to watch. The noise level rose and fell as machinery ran. Rubble flew out of the gaping holes in the wall left from the fire. It seemed to take forever before anything had enough support to let a full rescue team advance. The work was tireless, but no one complained. Nathan was their brother in the department and they'd do everything they could to get him out of there. Nathan drifted in and out of his dream. It really was quite pleasant wherever he was, he thought. No one seemed to be bothering him, so he could study for the final exams a bit more. Yet, that didn't sound right somehow. One eye attempted to open, but an odd noise stopped him. A motor running nearby had him trying to figure out what was going on. Scenes ran through his mind in a jumble and only confused him more. If he was at school, then why did he hear a chainsaw? No, it was the air conditioner in the room, Nathan decided. That satisfied him long enough for him to pass out once more. One of the men got close enough to see that Nathan was indeed alive but still not responding. Long arms reached out to place an oxygen mask over Nathan's pale face. With a sense of dread, the man wanted to pull Nathan's battered body back with him. But the reality was all around him. Nathan was in serious trouble. Determined, he reported his findings to the captain and went back to helping the others. A renewed energy went through the men as they doubled their efforts in removing everything in their path. Beams shifted and creaked while the men braced what they couldn't move. Teams came and went as air tanks beeped and energy ran low. They didn't even notice the sweat that coated their bodies inside the heavy protective gear. No one spoke, but minds raced. Each knew it could be them needing help someday. Every single one. Time was of the utmost importance for Nathan. The tension lessened as one of the medics slid into the small space they made next to him to assess his condition. Lights shone from above to let him find a vein and get some fluids running into the young man's system. Minutes became critical as the work continued to free him. Heavy boots pushed aside soaking wet boxes, old furniture, and broken toys. The noise was overwhelming, making it impossible to communicate without shouting. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Everyone was focused solely on freeing Nathan. Each of them felt a small sense of accomplishment when they braced the last boards holding Nathan's legs. It lasted only moments as they all got a clearer look at the angle they laid at. The oxygen mask remained over his face as they splinted his mangled legs. Medication now kept him sedated to endure any pain they might cause in getting him out. Trained personnel took their time to prevent further injury before working the backboard under him. Shouts of joy filled the air when at last the other firefighters saw the tired men haul the stretcher through the charred doorway. They rushed him to the ambulance with a sense of accomplishment. Weary men collapsed to the ground to catch their breath and say a prayer. Worry filled their eyes as they talked to each other in small groups. Ethan had called Nathan's parents, and they were on the way to the hospital already. They'd left before the rescue team had freed Nathan from the building and were on their way to Ridgeway General Hospital. Ethan promised he'd be there after asking for permission to leave. Nathan was his best friend, and he needed to go. The rest of the crew would come when they finished cleaning up at the fire. It took hours to remove the equipment and declare the fire out. Curious neighbors had left when the excitement was over, and soon all the trucks pulled out. Only Emily remained behind. Only Nathan knew she had gone into that building, and he wasn't talking. The wail of the siren alerted the staff at Ridgeway General Hospital of the impending arrival of the ambulance. Doctors and nurses raced to the emergency room to meet the paramedics bringing Nathan in. Machines spat out data and computers beeped as information came through. Specialists were on their way in and an operating room stood ready. Vitals and statistics crackled over the radio. Was it possible to be dead and still have to pee, he wondered? Nathan's bladder screamed for relief until the question took over his mind. He thought he squirmed just as he'd done in Ms. Milton's first-grade class. The other kids laughed when he ran to the restroom to make it in time. It occurred to him just then that he'd never have any children now that he died. That distracted him for a few minutes until he imagined himself running toward the fire station restroom only to find it locked. A blinking sign told him it was for staff only. He tried to tell them he worked there, but no one seemed to be listening to him. Everyone looked concerned and worried as they all gathered around a tall man standing to the side. He wanted to see what was so important, but he really had to find somewhere to pee. Sounds bombarded him from every direction. Loud, urgent voices firing off questions, though he never heard any answers. A machine nearby beeped in perfect sync with the pressure building inside him. He tried to block it out, but the urge consumed his thoughts until, too late, he let go. Seconds passed before Nathan realized something strange. His legs weren't getting wet. They should have been. He was lying down after all. He felt the relief of release, which could only mean one thing. His earlier suspicion was correct. He was dead. A vision of his parents filled his mind, and he knew how devastated they would be to lose him. Sadness hit him for all the things he'd never have a chance to do now. What happened to him anyway, he wondered. He thought back to see what he could remember of his last days at work. It felt like sweat trickled down his back as he searched for the cause of his demise. Maybe he'd never know, Nathan told himself. Several minutes later, when he'd about given up, an awful blaring noise scared him so much he decided that if he wasn't dead, it would have given him a heart attack. People shouted all around him and moved in close to his body. It struck him as odd that they'd want to be near someone dead like that. He wanted to ask about it, but his tongue couldn't move. Then he decided they wouldn't hear him anyway, so why bother? His eyes fluttered open, but the glaring light had them shutting again. So much heat radiated down on him from the bulbs that he imagined sweat dripping into his ears. Now the tiny drops tickled as they followed the curve of his neck to land, who knew where. He wished he had something to use so he could wipe it off his skin. No, Nathan thought. That made no sense. Dead people didn't feel stuff anymore. Girl. The single word came out of his parched lips. Nathan felt an odd sense of desperation as his scrambled head worked to remember more. He knew dead people often communicated with those still living, and he tried again. Nathan, tell me again what you said? A dark-haired woman asked. Girl? Need? Do you have a girlfriend? Someone will let her know. Don't worry, the woman said as she turned away. That didn't feel right to Nathan, so he closed his eyes to think. He never realized how tiring it was to be dead. A soft feminine voice penetrated his musings to tell him the surgeon was on the way. The woman seemed to be reassuring him of this as she took the rest of his clothes off. His head began to throb with all the confusion in it from discovering he died. Nathan emptied his mind to it all and imagined himself alive and at the beach. It was a scene from the movies like he'd watched a dozen times before. Sick and injured people glanced over from the waiting area. Small children cried or slept as each parent listened for their name from the nurse to go in next. A tired-looking housekeeper pushed a broom down the halls and emptied trash cans. People hurried past, doing their work. It all looked so normal. Ethan hated it. The smells and sounds all seemed to represent gloom to him. There was a silence despite all the noise and confusion. He felt the spirits as they left lifeless bodies from car accidents, fights, or illnesses. People cried and shook with sadness as they tried to piece together whatever news the doctors just gave them. His stomach churned when he thought of it all. Every firefighter knew the risks of their job. Each one had training and equipment to carry out their assigned task. They chose their profession for different reasons. All of them understood that fires were unpredictable. Stories of injuries and deaths made their way around the stations. Ethan never imagined Nathan making a mistake of going back alone into that building. Ethan. Mr. Carter called out from several feet down the hallway. What have you heard? Mrs. Carter asked. He's in bad shape, Ethan said. They kept him heavily sedated while assessing his injuries. Last we heard, they took him into surgery. Ethan introduced the Carters to the anxious group of men waiting. A few of them knew Nathan's parents and hugged them close as they offered words of encouragement. Each confirmed their admiration and respect for the young man. Ronald Carter knew the risks that went with his son's job. His brother had died while fighting a warehouse blaze in another state. He knew this was what Nathan wanted to do and still supported him all the way. All he wanted right now was to hear that his son would be okay. I'll let them know you're here, Ethan said. Nathan's parents looked at each other and nodded. Nathan felt himself drifting, his mind hazy and unfocused. He sensed activity around him with muted voices coming from both sides and even behind him. A sudden sensation hit his thigh, and he briefly wondered if he had lost control again. His thoughts were scattered, disconnected from one another, only adding to his confusion. A sharp pain in his leg had him swearing in his head. Nathan felt hands on his skin and tried to find the significance of the words he heard. Frustration at his inability to figure anything out wore him out. He floated away and left the questions for those still alive. Very little helpful information came through on Nathan. A nurse informed his parents that the surgery was going as expected. At one point, the emergency room thinned out and grew quieter for a short time. Members of the Ridgeway Fire Department filled the room as they all waited. The clock never seemed to change, yet it felt like they'd been there forever. No one slept, but neither did anyone talk much. What more could any of them say? They each knew it might be them lying in there someday. The reality hit hard but only made their decision to stand by as a group that much stronger. Someone would be there until Nathan was out of danger. The hospital bustled with renewed activity around 6 in the morning as Ethan stared into the halls. He looked at the weary crew and wished they were all sitting back at the station playing poker. Stacks of empty coffee cups lined the small table in the private waiting room. This wasn't where any of them ever wanted to be. But Nathan was their brother, and they needed to be right here. Ethan remained with Nathan's parents as the others came and went with the shift change. Captain Joseph Reed joined the group on his way into the station for the day. He'd been in touch during the night by phone. "The investigators are on the scene," Joseph said after he took a brief phone call. "They'll be in touch." Ethan nodded at the news and hoped it gave them some answers to why Nathan was in that building anyway. He'd gone over everything so many times it was a blur now, but nothing jogged his memory. It made no sense. Nathan had the same training as the rest of them. He knew better than to enter that structure alone. His head spun with all the questions he had. "Something's wrong about the fire," Jason said. "What do you mean, Jason?" Joseph asked. "Preliminary findings look like faulty wiring started the fire. The building's primary structure was wood with several additions to it. You see something there I should know about?" Joseph asked. Jason hesitated for a moment. "The explosion," he said. He let his words drift off as he went back to the scene in his mind. The tenants said the manager kept some propane tanks for his gas grill in the storage area under the back stairs, Joseph said as he watched Jason. Joseph knew of the young man and his desire to become an investigator someday. He remembered an older man trapped in his car that Jason rescued a while back. The vehicle had left the road and hit some trees down in a ravine. Several people drove past the spot, but no one noticed anything. Something about how the weeds seemed pressed down in that area caught Jason's attention, though. He had parked his truck to investigate and followed the tracks. His instincts ended up saving a life. Joseph took Jason by the elbow and led him to a private corner. He wanted to hear this young man's thoughts. "Sir, with all due respect, tanks have a specific pattern when they explode," Jason said. "Go on, Jason," Joseph said. "2 tanks are the most anyone ever saw in that room, according to those I questioned," Jason told him. "You could also picture where that space is in relation to the area they found Nathan. The storage room is on the complete opposite end. That building had 8 apartments in it. The fire went through all the units," Joseph said. "It left all the walls and ceilings unstable." "I agree, but you felt the severity of the blast." "Those 2 tanks didn't do it," Jason remarked. "Gas lines?" Joseph asked. "The area only has electric." "I've checked." "You have a theory, Jason?" Jason hesitated. "Sir, it's too early for that. I'm sure the investigators will find the cause." Joseph watched as Jason turned back to the group of weary firefighters. He talked to them for a few minutes before saying something about his report and leaving. Joseph suspected he really was on his way back to the scene of the fire. Emily was so cold that she'd stopped shivering long ago. It took every bit of energy she had left just to breathe. Shooting pains in her chest made it difficult to want to do that anymore. She regretted her rash decision from the night before as she worried about the firefighter and his fate. The assorted smells had long ago blended into one that stuffed her sinuses and made her head pound. Once during the night, she swore an animal crawled over her. She tried to scream, but her throat just didn't work. Emily blocked out everything after that until she woke to voices outside. She could see a hint of light and knew it must be morning. Hope flared in her as she realized help was near. The sluggishness of her brain didn't make it easy for her to work out a plan to get their attention, though. She gave in to the darkness before she could do anything more. Jason talked to the head of the team investigating the fire as soon as he got to the scene. Tom Carson was getting ready to retire in a few years. He had a good feeling about Jason and encouraged him to follow his dream. "I figured I'd see you this morning, Jason," Tom said with a grin. "Did you find anything yet?" Jason cut right to business. "This old building didn't have a chance, really. It had little chunks added over the 30 years it's been here. The wiring was a disaster everywhere. We traced the start of the fire to an electrical box in one of the apartments." "What about the explosion?" Jason asked. Tom sighed. "I'm not done checking, but the tanks might be the culprit." Jason shook his head but remained silent. He respected the older man, but he knew something else was going on here. Tom studied Jason's expression a moment before replying. "Talk to me, son." They talked over the possible causes from outside the building until Jason asked if they could go inside. He wanted Tom to see for himself why there had to be another explanation. Jason led the way to where they found Nathan the night before and looked around. "We're on the opposite end of the building from those tanks, Tom." Nathan was buried under at least 3 feet of rubble. The older man carefully stepped over beams and scattered debris, studying the burn patterns. Chunks of charred plaster hung from the ceiling and lay in damp piles across the floor. He paused at intervals, and Jason could tell he was analyzing the scene, piecing everything together in his mind. "I'll get the full team on this right away," Tom said. "Is there anything else, Jason? Why did Nathan come in here? It had to be something so important he'd risk his life." "That's it, Jason," Tom said in an excited tone. "Nathan came back to rescue someone else. There isn't any other reason that makes sense. All the tenants living here were accounted for last night. Jason. It's the only thing that fits, Tom." The men exited the building and found Joseph walking toward them. A brief discussion caught them all up on the investigation to that point. It took only a moment for Joseph to stop Jason when he began explaining about the possibility of someone still being in there. "I heard some of the nurses talking about Nathan this morning," Joseph said. "One of them was in the emergency room when they brought him in last night and said she swore he tried to talk. The only thing she could make out was something like girl or get girl. She figured Nathan had a girlfriend and wanted her there." "Jason, that fits your theory," Joseph said. It didn't take long before more men arrived to search the areas close to where they'd found Nathan. Jason was right there with them, picking through the cold ashes. He stood back for a moment to picture the explosion in his mind. Different scenarios played through of Nathan just entering or soon exiting the building. No one else was in the basement with Nathan, so Jason guessed the other person was behind him at the time of the blast. What was left of the walls formed a teepee of sorts against one of the major roof beams that fell into the area Jason stood in. Every instinct in him said this was the place to look. It made sense. If Nathan was on his way out with the other person, they would have run through the section to the exit just a short distance away. He needed to find Joseph. Jason sent a crew in where he pointed, and the work began. No one said anything, but they all knew the odds of finding someone alive were slim. The work was just as tedious as when they'd looked for Nathan. 1 hour became 2 before a yell erupted. "I see someone." One of the workers hollered for Joseph as the others ran over to help him. Braces and supports went up, and soon they had enough room for a paramedic to squeeze into the space they'd made. It didn't take long before they had the slender body of the unknown girl strapped to a board and on her way to an ambulance. Joseph stopped Jason with a hand on his shoulder. "You'll make a great investigator one day. This department will be fortunate to have someone like you, Jason." "Tom," Joseph said. They watched the ambulance take off for the hospital with the girl inside. Her injured arm remained wrapped around the box they found lying on her chest. Maybe it held some clues to her identity, they decided as they went back to work looking for the cause of the explosion. Nathan's parents sat in a private office with the tired surgeon and tried to understand his words. The operation to repair their son's crushed legs was delicate and tedious. Details went over their heads, but they asked a few questions. They would keep him heavily sedated to prevent both pain and movement, the doctor said. He mentioned how lucky their son was not to lose one or both legs. To be sure, they knew the severity of his injuries. The 3 of them spent some time talking about Nathan's immediate treatment and prognosis. Then the doctor's pager beeped. He excused himself after checking the message and ran from the room. The emergency room buzzed with activity once more as another ambulance pulled up to the entrance. Data sent through earlier fluctuated from the current readings on their newest patient, causing great concern to the techs. They passed the information on to the correct personnel as the paramedics rolled the stretcher in. Voices shouted for x-rays and tests while nurses cut clothing out of the way and attached more equipment. Emily heard what sounded like a group of people all talking at the same time. She wondered why the person in charge didn't tell them all to be quiet. Then it crossed her mind that things might be different wherever she was now that she wasn't alive anymore. A woman near Emily didn't answer when she asked how she died. That seemed odd to Emily and even a bit rude. Images came to her of the firefighter, and Emily worried about him. She hoped that he wasn't in this place with all these loud people like she was. Emily decided to move away but found she couldn't lift her head. That's when she heard what sounded like a drill. She became so confused she stopped trying to figure it out. Nurses carried out orders and anticipated others on the young girl. Already, the surgeons were scrubbing for the operation to repair the obvious injuries to her abdomen. Later, her broken arm would be set and put in a cast. One of the orderlies leaned over Emily and began to speak. "My name is Bill, miss. Do you have any family around here?" Emily listened to the deep voice close to her and thought about his question. Something about it made her sad, but she couldn't think what it was. The voice sounded kind, but Emily panicked and tried to search for the special box. At least she thought she did. Somehow it didn't feel as if her arm moved, so she did it again. Her energy ran out, though, and she forgot what she was trying to do. Instead, Emily saw herself as a child running through a field of flowers, while her parents watched from a blanket nearby. Emily's surgery began soon after. Only this time, the waiting room didn't have anxious family and friends of the patient in it. Mr. and Mrs. Carter heard about the mysterious girl and tried to make sense of it all. Did she have anything to do with why their son was in that building when it exploded? They wondered. Nathan would risk his life to save another, but how did he know she was in there? Then the questions mounted. But the two with answers weren't able to talk right now. Her body felt strange again, but Emily couldn't tell what was wrong. She heard people talking and wanted to ask something, but her lips wouldn't move. A masked face appeared above her. Before she could figure it out, though, an odd sensation took hold of her until she drifted off. Back at the scene of the fire, the investigating team sifted through each room with renewed effort. Finding the girl that morning brought a new set of questions for what appeared to be a simple fire in the beginning. Now they searched for clues to who she was and why she was in the building, along with the source of the blast. Each one hoped that maybe Nathan would be able to give them some answers. The day went on and no one knew anything more than they had that morning. Nathan was still under strong medication and his doctor ordered no visitors except for his parents. Fear hit Ronald Carter as he stood next to Nathan's bed and looked at all the machinery and tubes attached to his son. His cheek had a large bruise along with several scrapes and cuts. Nathan's arms and chest had dressings covering gashes. He knew from talking to the doctor any of the beams that hit his son could have taken his life. Ronald now admitted how lucky his son was. "Oh, Ronald," Lillian Carter whispered to her husband as she edged in closer to get a look at her son. "He's strong and a fighter. Nathan will be just fine." "You're right," she said with renewed determination. She leaned over her son's bed and talked to him in a soft voice for several minutes until the nurse asked them to leave again. Lillian gave Nathan a kiss on his forehead and promised she'd be back. Her husband squeezed their son's hand and left the room. The couple held each other in the hall and let the tears fall. Emily shook her head and attempted to open her eyes. A buzzing woke her that sounded like her alarm clock, but much louder. Confused, she wondered why no one turned it off. Unless she was alone, and then it was up to her to find the switch, she told herself. She shoved the covers off and started to swing her legs off the bed. "Hello, young lady," a cheery voice said near Emily. "Trying to wake up, are you?" Startled, Emily's eyes popped open. "Who are you?" she asked the woman standing next to her bed. "My name is Jill. I have some questions for you if you don't mind," the blonde said. Emily nodded and waited for her to speak again. The events of the last few days rushed at her when she realized she was in a hospital room. "You didn't have any identification on you when they brought you in. Can you tell me your name?" Jill asked. "Emily Carter. We can contact your family for you if you'd like." "Do you have no?" Emily said before the other woman could finish. "I don't have anyone." Jill didn't react to her statement as she went on to the next questions about Emily's general health. It was several minutes before the woman stopped talking and just looked at Emily. "You're a lucky girl, Emily." "I know," she whispered. "The firefighter, can you tell me? Did he make it out?" Jill hesitated before answering. "Captain Reed is waiting to speak to you. I can get him if you'd like." Tears trickled down Emily's cheeks as she thought about someone losing their life to save her. "Okay." Jill left and Emily closed her eyes since the pounding in her head made her dizzy. She rested until Joseph knocked on her door an hour later. "I'm Captain Reed. Jill told me you were awake and ready to have a visitor. She wouldn't tell me if he made it out." Joseph took his time answering the pale young girl. Anger over the situation wouldn't get answers, he knew. "Miss Carter, can you tell me what you remember?" Emily hesitated for only a few seconds. She admitted staying in the apartment the night before the fire. A brief outline followed of her walk to town in the afternoon and the return to see the building in flames. Joseph heard the emotion in her voice when she talked about the papers in the container in her closet. He already knew that she still had it with her when they brought her into the emergency room but didn't say it. The next part was a bit more random as Emily tried to remember the exact way she went into the building. Joseph offered quiet words of reassurance as she led him through, Nathan following her inside. She pictured it in her mind to be able to give Joseph the details he wanted so she didn't miss anything important. Things were sketchier just before the explosion when she ran out of air and fell. She told him everything. "You're doing great," Joseph said. "What do you remember about the explosion?" "Everything just blew up around me and the floor shifted. Something knocked me out, I guess. I think I woke up a few times, but I'm not sure if I was dreaming or not. They found Nathan last night. He's the young man that went in after you," Joseph explained after she'd finished. "Is he going to be all right? Please tell me." Joseph gave her the few facts that he could on Nathan's condition before wishing her a speedy recovery. He took a few steps to the door and stopped. "One of the investigators will be in to see you before you leave. They have some questions as well. Thank you for seeing me today." He walked down the halls to the unit where Nathan was and thought about her words. Joseph sensed her feelings of guilt and wondered what was in the box important enough to risk her life. That was something he hoped to discover on his next visit to her, he decided. Ethan was back to work, as were many of the others that spent hours waiting for word on Nathan during his surgery. Someone from the station was always there after their shift ended, sitting in the small room with his family and friends. The Carters were staying in town until they knew he was out of danger. Of course, they went to Nathan's apartment for a few hours of much-needed sleep before returning the next morning. Jason talked to Tom the night before, hoping his team had uncovered some evidence in their search. The owner of the building seemed a bit anxious to have them finish when Jason saw him. According to Tom, the building had a huge insurance policy on it that made them suspicious, too. He also refused to answer several of their questions without a lawyer present. The men agreed they needed more answers, and soon. Little squiggly worms floated in front of his eyes as Nathan tried to remember what he was supposed to be doing today. He watched them move along in slow motion until they blended into one large blob. Odd how they did that, he thought, and went back to figuring out his plans. It was so warm already that Nathan decided he'd rather go swimming. His body felt stiff, and so he determined he could use the exercise, too. Strange things happened even here. Now he just had to make up an excuse for missing work. Lillian Carter sat next to her son's bed and wondered what was going on in his mind. She talked to him about the trip she and his dad had to take for their 30th anniversary next year. It hurt to think he might never be able to do some of his favorite sports again. But the alternative was far worse. There was always good if you looked for it, she reminded herself. Emily wasn't supposed to get out of bed alone yet. The nurses reminded her to use the call bell, but they didn't know her independent streak. She wanted another pillow and remembered seeing one in the closet. It only took her a few minutes to work out how to maneuver with all her tubes and hoses. A rush of adrenaline hit her when she opened the door and saw what sat on the shelf. The box. It wasn't heavy even though it was full. Emily set it on her bedside table and thought about the firefighter. Nathan. She now knew his name. No one told her anything about him, but her room was right by the nurse's station and she heard them talking. She knew they blamed her even though they tried not to show it when they took care of her. Looking at the box, it shocked her that she'd taken such a risk. One glance at the contents was all it took to remind her. Pages of documents and letters made up a large bundle. A smaller one had the only photos remaining of her parents. A brief glimpse pacified her that the pictures were all there. It would take longer to sort through the papers, but she had no choice. Someone had gone through them since she'd last put the box away. Fear at what might be missing gave her enough energy to begin the task. Tom listened to the apartment building owner complain again about how much of an inconvenience the fire was to him and wanted to walk away. Grease odors and stale cigarette smoke clung to the overweight man. "You people are hunting for something that ain't there," he said. "Mr. Bloomfield, the insurance company and our department, I got a business to run, and you ain't letting me. If you have a problem with me being here, we can always call the cops to sort it out," Tom replied. William Bloomfield didn't want any more cops on his property. The fire had caused enough attention, but now he just wanted things wrapped up. Over the years, he had learned to cover his tracks better than in the beginning. He chuckled at how easy it was to make some people believe just about anything. "You find something funny about all these people having nowhere to live, Mr. Bloomfield? Just get off my land before I make sure you do," William told him before he turned away. Tom longed to find proof that this man wanted the building to burn. All his instincts told him Bloomfield was as shady as they came. He watched as William stuffed himself into his new Lincoln Navigator and drove away. His determination to find some evidence made him pull out his cell phone and call Jason. Lillian sat at her son's side and read from a book of poetry. Ronald was out taking care of business on his laptop when someone knocked on the door. She stepped into the hall to see who it was since Nathan couldn't have many visitors yet. "Are you Nathan's mom?" "Yes, but you're her, aren't you?" Lillian said in an angry tone. "It's my fault he's hurt." Emily's words came out in a quivering voice as she felt the older woman's pain. "Why are you here?" Lillian asked. "I wanted to tell him how sorry I am. But I know he isn't awake yet. The doctor said he's releasing me tomorrow and then I won't be able to see him either. Will you just let him know for me, please?" Emily turned to leave, but Lillian's question stopped her. "Why did you go in there when you could see it wasn't safe?" "It's a long story and I don't expect you to understand." "Try me," Lillian said. Just 2 words, but Emily felt the power in them. Emily studied the other woman's face and decided to take a risk and trust her. "I can show you better." The 2 women walked to Emily's room without speaking. Both had so much on their minds they didn't know where to begin. Lillian closed the door for privacy and waited. An hour later, she held a sobbing Emily in her arms and wished she knew what to do now. Papers and documents lay on the bed and table, showing a trail of obvious deceit. Ronald would be able to help, but Lillian felt lost with all the information she'd heard. "You need to show this to the authorities. Someone has to stop this before it happens again. Where are you going to stay when you leave here?" Emily wiped her nose again and shrugged. "I was hoping I could find a shelter to take me in for now. Everything I owned was in that apartment. I'm going to see if my husband is with Nathan. He'll be worried about me. Then we're both coming back here to figure something out," Lillian said before she walked out. Nathan felt the stinging in his leg and wished it would stop. His eyes felt too heavy to open, so he didn't bother trying. A soft humming sound reminded him of an aquarium filter running. More sounds came to him from every direction. He made a mental note to check his tires after listening to the hissing of air escaping from one. A clanging upset him because now he'd be late for dinner again. His mom hated that too. Nathan swore he heard her voice as more images carried him back into their midst. Lillian ran into Joseph and Jason in the hall just outside Nathan's room. She peeked in to see her husband sitting in the corner reading a magazine. A quick wave of her hand brought Ronald out to join the others. She told them about Emily coming to see Nathan. The men all had questions, but Lillian felt it was up to the young girl to tell them. So she took the men with her back to see Emily. It didn't take them long to see the value in what Emily held in the box. Jason looked at Joseph and nodded before he went back to checking the papers. "Do you see why I had to get this now?" Emily asked the group. "I only have the originals here. We need to make copies of all this to be safe." "I'm going to talk to someone in the office here that I know about it," Joseph said. "I'll be back soon." Ronald and Lillian talked with Jason and Emily but didn't bring up the fire again. The others could see the strain on the young girl's face from her part in the last hour. Jason told some funny stories about his neighbor's black lab and soon had her smiling. Ronald added a tale from his childhood about a collie as he tried to top Jason. "Looks like I missed something funny," Joseph said when he returned to find them all with tears in their eyes from laughing so much. The group shared a silly grin before bursting out once more. Emily held her stomach in discomfort at the exertion and grimaced. Lillian noticed and went to her side right away. "Lay back, Emily. Let me help." "Ronald, will you get a nurse for her, please?" Jason stepped aside as the older man returned in less than a minute with one of the staff. It didn't take long before Emily was resting again from the pain medication administered. Lillian herded the men into the hall and shut the door. "There are 2 extra copies now," Joseph spoke first as they wandered into an empty sitting area. "I put one in her box with the originals." "And the other set?" Jason asked from across the room. "Safe." Ronald and Lillian just nodded while Jason looked at the man for a moment. Ethics and honesty were important to Jason. This didn't quite feel right to him. "Will you tell her you have them?" "If I have to, yes, I will. It's really for her own good, Jason." If the wrong person heard about what she has, Jason didn't need him to finish. He knew what happened all too often when a scumbag thief went after something he wanted. "I understand." William Bloomfield felt the sweat in every crease of his rotund body, even though the air conditioning was on. Odd sounds came from the decrepit desk chair in the dreary room he used for his personal office. This was where the real books and documents were. Only those he knew wouldn't talk came in here. Chubby fingers sorted through the stack of folders and files in front of him. A triumphant smile came over his face when he found what he wanted and shoved the rest to the side. Several tumbled to the grimy floor, but William didn't bother with them. These documents held his full interest. He read them and grinned. Memories of the couple that owned the house on the corner came back to him. They didn't have a clue what was going on when he approached them that afternoon so long ago. A simple conversation about their location got him just what he'd hoped to find. Both the man and wife were naive in business and fell for his offer to purchase their place for a huge sum. Contracts with small print they didn't understand confused them, so William translated for them. Of course, what he told them wasn't at all the same, but they trusted him. The thought of such a large amount of money, and William's charm, had them signing in no time. Only they didn't get what he'd said. In fact, William only gave them a quarter of the market value for their house. They went to a lawyer, but since the couple signed without coercion, they didn't have a case. William gave them a week to get out before he took over. The following day, bulldozers razed the entire place. The apartment complex went up, and William collected the rent each month with a grin. It was just the beginning of his underhanded dealings. Over the years, he built another apartment building across town on property he got for almost nothing from a grieving widow who just wanted out of her house. Now the cops were asking him about the fire. William wiped the sweat off his forehead with a filthy rag and tossed it onto the desk. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Sparky had a lot to answer for, and he'd better tell William what he wanted to hear or there would be trouble. "The cops are snooping around the apartment building," William said instead of a greeting when Sparky answered. "Let 'em. Ain't nothing for 'em to find. You heard a fireman and a girl were in there when the place exploded, didn't you?" "Too bad for them, but it ain't my fault they was in there," Sparky said in a defensive voice. "If the cops find something, Sparky, you better run, 'cause I ain't going down alone." William slammed the phone down and cursed. He covered his tracks so well for years. Now, however, the apartment building was old and needed costly repairs. With the insurance policy he carried on it, the fire was a better solution. It didn't matter to him if anyone lost their possessions, as long as he profited. That's what he was in it for. Faded documents sat on the desk in front of him as William tried to figure out what nagged at him. This wasn't the first time Sparky worked for him. Nothing suspicious ever came up from the other fires. So why this one? He kept asking himself. It couldn't be because of the two people trapped in there, since they were the ones stupid enough to go back in. William closed the file and mopped the dripping sweat from his face again. He left the office and decided to drive past the site of the fire to see what, if anything, was going on. Maybe the investigation was over, and he'd get that fat insurance check soon. That lifted William's spirits, until he got near the apartment building. He turned at the corner when he saw all the vehicles in the driveway. A quick flick of the switch cranked the air conditioning up when he felt the sweat drip down his back. An evil smirk crossed his face as he crossed town and made his way to the ramshackle old house almost hidden in the woods. Sparky was getting company. Jason worked with Tom and his small crew to search for that one single clue that might give them the answer they needed. His instincts told him they were in the right area, though. "Check this out, boss," one of the men said. Tom studied the section for several minutes before walking around to the apartment next to where they worked. Inside, he gazed at the destruction and worked out some possibilities in his head. "Jason," Tom called out, "look at this." It didn't take long for the two men to find the proof they needed that the explosion wasn't from the propane tanks. A quick call to the police department had Chief Jared Nolan on his way. More searching found the source of the fire as well. Angry at the sleaze who arranged this, the group of men went outside to wait. Ridgway's police chief was sharp. Though not from the area, he'd been there long enough that everyone called him a local. Arson was an ugly word, and even worse when innocent people lost everything they owned because of it. Nevertheless, they only had evidence of how the fire started, not who did it. That was going to be his department's job. Samples went into the proper containers and were labeled after one of the team photographed everything. A tired but triumphant bunch soon left. They just hoped it wouldn't take long for the police department to find the culprit. Joseph knocked on Emily's hospital room door later that same evening. He wanted to talk to the girl about what steps she should take next. Somehow he felt sorry for her even though he knew Nathan was hurt because of her. "Emily, are you awake? It's Captain Reed." "Come in, Mr. Reed. You can call me Joseph." He grinned when she blushed but just went on. "I hope you don't mind that I'm here." "Not at all, Joseph. I get bored by myself." "You're going to the police, aren't you? The documents you have prove enough to start an investigation into Bloomfield." Joseph felt certain there was a connection between the arson and some of the transactions shown in Emily's box of papers. "Right before the fire, I decided I had enough proof to do that." I wanted to keep an eye on the slime bag, though. That's why you moved into the apartment building, Joseph said with a knowing look. Yes, it is. I'll help in any way I can if you'll let me. Emily, why would you do that? It's my fault Nathan is hurt. You should hate me. Nathan knew the risks going in after you. He made the decision himself. I can't say it was a good one, but I'm sure anyone in the department would do the same thing in that situation. Saving people is part of what we do. If I didn't go in, he'd be all right, though. Joseph sighed. Emily, if Nathan didn't go in after you, we might not have found you for days. Those two little words he said in the emergency room made all the difference. He's going to get better, right? No one will really tell me, Emily said, her voice pleading. We're all praying for him, Joseph answered. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Joseph hesitated before speaking again. I heard you don't have a place to stay after they discharge you tomorrow. Where are you planning to go? A shelter, I guess, Emily admitted. I don't have anywhere else. Joseph shook his head. I want to be sure you're somewhere safe. Let me call a friend of mine and see what I can do. He stepped over and used the hospital phone while Emily waited. She couldn't believe he was helping her, but she admitted it felt good to have someone on her side again. Joseph hung up and turned back to her. That's all set. Edna has a huge old house in town, right down from the police station. Don't worry about anything when you're there. She loves to take care of people. He went on to explain that Edna was a spinster in her 70s but spry as a 50-year-old. Town folk fight over her cookies and brownies at the school bake sales, he said with a wink. Emily laughed when she realized he was one of them. They agreed on a time and Joseph turned to leave. Joseph? Yes, Emily? She hesitated. I don't have any clothes. She blushed but didn't look away. Joseph took a small notebook from his pocket and put it on her bedside table along with his pen. Write down a few things you need with the sizes, and I'll get someone to pick them up for you. Several minutes later, he waved and left with her list in hand. Nathan thought the incessant sound of the saws would drive him crazy. Who allowed them inside here, anyway? Maybe he'd just go turn them off himself since no one else seemed to be. He decided. He slipped his arm out from under the covers to push them to the side. At least he thought he did. A second attempt came back with the same results. There wasn't a blanket over him. No, that wasn't right. Nathan knew he was much too warm not to have something covering him. That meant he didn't have an arm then. A moment of panic swept over him before a rational thought told him, of course, that wasn't the correct answer. So why wasn't it working as it should then? He asked himself. The noise got louder before it just stopped. Nathan started to relax until he realized not all the machines were off. Gentle waves came to mind as he tried to place what type of equipment he heard. A soft floating sensation seemed to encompass his entire body. From it, visions of fluffy clouds high in the sky brought a peaceful feeling to him. And he soon forgot his original concern over the sounds. Nathan decided some parts of being dead weren't so bad after all, and drifted away once more. Early Friday morning, Emily's doctor signed her release papers. She sat in her room and waited for Joseph to pick her up as arranged the night before. All the events of the past week crowded into her brain and weighed down on her shoulders. Memories of happy times with her parents renewed her desire to fight the ones responsible for hurting them. Good morning, Emily, Joseph said as he walked into her room a short time later. Are you ready to leave this place? Emily smiled when he tossed several packages onto her bed. You know I am. I hope you like the clothes. Lillian picked them out for you. Joseph, are you serious? He watched her peek into the bags and pull out an assortment of items. Satisfied, Emily carried the pile of clothing to the bathroom. The soft sweater and denim jeans were a perfect fit, she soon discovered. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes as she thought of Nathan's mother shopping for her. She vowed that someday she'd pay her back for all the kindness the woman had shown her. Edna was the grandmother everyone wanted to have, Emily decided within minutes of meeting her. Her concern was genuine when she saw how tired Emily was after the quick tour of the main floor. A small bedroom in the back of the house was all set up for her. Joseph put the bags of clothing on a chair along with the rescued box of papers. He grinned and grabbed a handful of fresh cookies off the counter on his way out. Duty calls, he reminded them with a wave. I don't know about that man, Edna said with a laugh. He's just like a kid when he comes here. Always sneaking my cookies. One of these days, he'll get his hands slapped. Emily chuckled at the idea of Edna standing guard over the chocolate chip cookies while Joseph tried to snitch a few. It was obvious to her the older woman respected and liked the man. She guessed Edna provided him with more than his share of baked goods anyway. Ethan stood in the doorway of Nathan's room for several minutes without going closer. The heat closed in around him and threatened to cut off his air. Machines hummed and beeped, telling the staff more information than Ethan could imagine. An odd smell made his stomach lurch. Yet Nathan didn't react to any of it. "Hey, Nathan. One of the nurses let me in. She's pretty cute, too. Maybe you can ask her out." The words stuck in his throat when he realized Nathan might never be able to go on a date again. It scared him that Nathan wasn't waking up. Ethan admitted. He looked at the wall to settle his thoughts before starting over. "So, I'm thinking of asking Kendra to marry me. It makes me a bit nervous, though. She might refuse, and then what will I do? You think I should go for it?" Ethan knew he wouldn't get any answers, but Lillian told him to talk when he was with Nathan. Many people felt a patient heard things going on around them even when they didn't respond. He felt silly but kept up the one-sided conversation until a nurse came in to say his visiting time was up. He wanted to shake Nathan awake but knew that wouldn't do any good. Instead, Ethan reached over and touched Nathan's shoulder. "Buddy, you're a fighter. Don't give up now. I'll come back whenever they let me." Did everyone speak through canisters here? Nathan wondered. The voice sounded odd yet comforting in a way. It reminded him of when he'd broken his arm in 3rd grade. His father didn't scold him for climbing onto the garage roof. Nathan knew his dad was upset then, but he never yelled. He had that same feeling of letting somebody down now. His mouth was too dry to answer this person. Nathan knew. Maybe if he nodded, they would see that. He decided. Muscles that should move his head did nothing the first time. A second failed attempt only frustrated him. As the voice disappeared, death sure had its bad points, he concluded. An odd sensation took hold of his body just then, and swept him away. It was easier to give in than to struggle anyway. Nathan realized as he drifted off. William parked behind the stand of trees next to the driveway at Sparky's and hefted his bulk out of the car. The sun beat down on him as he made his way across the overgrown yard onto the rickety porch. Music blared from several speakers inside. Sparky loved noise. William hated it. He didn't knock before opening the warped door and squeezing through. The abrupt darkness was hard to adjust to after being in the brilliance outdoors. William squinted as he made his way to the workshop where he assumed Sparky would be. "You got sloppy, Sparky." Anger and disgust showed on William's face. Sparky pivoted at the accusation but didn't reply. "Cops all over the place." "I ain't worried," Sparky snorted and leaned against his workbench. "They all so dumb they ain't going to find nothing." William hated loose ends. That was one of the important parts of his trade and he had perfected it over the years. Now he looked at the punk in front of him and knew he'd have to take care of this one himself. Only a few feet separated the two as William thought through his options. His control snapped when Sparky laughed. A few minutes later, he left in a better mood. Gravel crunched under his shoes as he trudged back over to his car. William knew Sparky wasn't going to talk now. William parked his Lincoln Navigator in the garage when he got home. He made his way through the clutter to his bedroom where he stripped to take a shower. His clothes reeked of sweat, but he didn't even notice. They landed on the floor next to yesterday's clothes as he walked into the bathroom. Soap covered his skin as he scrubbed off the filth. William hated doing anything himself. But today he'd had no choice. Business came first. Ronald Carter sat with his son while Lillian went into town that afternoon. She wanted to check on Emily. He knew the doctors assured them Nathan was doing as well as they could hope physically. No one could say when he might wake up. Ronald refused to believe his son would remain this way forever. He went back to reading the latest novel, in hopes Nathan could hear him. Lillian had gotten directions to Edna's from Joseph. She rang the doorbell and introduced herself to the elderly woman who answered. Within 5 minutes, she had a hot cup of coffee in front of her at the kitchen table. The 3 women shared a plate of brownies as they talked and laughed together. Emily realized that she felt like she was part of a family again for the first time in years. Police Chief Jared Nolan sat behind the computer and scrolled through the files he'd pulled up. Nothing fit yet, but he knew it would if they just kept looking. He ran a hand over his tired eyes and logged off. Maybe the firefighter was awake and had some insight, he thought. Jason sat in Tom's office and waited for the older man to go on. He'd mentioned where Emily was staying, but Jason knew that wasn't the main thing on Tom's mind. "I think Emily is strong enough to talk to the police. She'll need someone with her, though. As part of the investigation team, it wouldn't be professional for me to go with her," Tom said. "Good point. Did you have someone in mind?" "You should go, Jason. Chief Nolan might ask her things about the fire. Your answers would all be unofficial, but they wouldn't risk the investigation either." Jason had no problem going with Emily. The idea was a good one, really. He wasn't quite ready to admit it to anyone, but he wanted to know more about her too, for personal reasons only. He knew she intrigued him somehow. The two men discussed the fire a bit more before Jason left. He promised Tom he'd stop at Edna's on his way home to talk to Emily after his night shift. Nathan felt sick to his stomach. Yet he didn't remember eating anything. Maybe that was it, he decided. The lack of food made him ill. Bile sat in his throat until it spilled over and dripped out of his mouth. Bubbles formed as he exhaled. The bitter taste clung to his tongue and lips. He moaned as the odor hit him. "Oh my God," Lillian said to her husband in a frantic voice. "Get a nurse, quick." Ronald ran from the room and returned less than a minute later. They stood to the side as two nurses came in and checked on their son. One suctioned the vomit from him while the other took his blood pressure. Soon a doctor joined them to examine Nathan as well. The light blinded him and he turned his head. Nathan muttered for them to leave him alone but wasn't sure anyone heard him. He wondered why things had to be so difficult in death. Life was already hard enough. The little energy he had left subsided and Nathan sought the peace of oblivion once more. Lillian grabbed her husband's sleeve to keep from falling. The shock of seeing Nathan move left her speechless. The doctor took them into the hall where he talked about the change in Nathan's condition and what it might indicate. He left them soon after and Lillian hurried back to Nathan's side. Her heart felt lighter as she read some poetry to him. She had faith he would be fine. Jason waited for Emily in the front room at Edna's the next morning. He'd explained his reason for stopping in and she'd left to get the packet of papers from her room. She admitted being nervous, so he kept the conversation friendly on the short drive to the police station. Once there, they met with Chief Nolan in his office. It didn't take Jared long to figure out what to do with the documents Emily had. He called in some favors and soon hoped to have supporting verification to go with her evidence. The two men commended her on the diligence it took to gather her information. "Your parents would be very proud of you," they both agreed. Emily listened while Jason discussed a few details of the fire. Jared added his thoughts and asked Emily some questions. Each one came to the same conclusion. "Can you bring him in for questioning?" Jason asked. "Not before I get the proof these are real." Jared pointed to the stack of papers and shook his head. The office door opened before anyone could reply. One of the officers popped his head in and told Jared they had a call he should know about. He excused himself and went into the hall. "I'm sorry, I have to go," Jared said as he strode into the room and grabbed his coat and hat. "Thank you for coming in. I'll be in touch." That left Jason with Emily. She accepted his offer to stop for coffee with a shy smile. Getting to know him interested her, for sure. Besides, he was cute, she thought to herself. Jason took her to a small diner she'd never been to before. The Hollywood-style decor fascinated her. They discussed some of their favorite actors and actresses over root beer floats. Emily noticed the blackboard announcing them as the special of the day and knew she had to have one. Jason grinned and ordered one, too. He dropped her off at Edna's with the promise to check on her after his next shift. Emily went inside with a huge grin on her face. Nathan's eyes fluttered open, and he found himself staring at the ceiling. Took him several minutes to figure out where he was. The fire came flooding back to him when he tried to move and realized his legs both had casts on them. A slight turn of his head showed he was alone in the room. Worry over the girl he had tried to get out of the building crinkled his forehead. A board on the wall gave the names of his nurses for the day. Nathan studied them as he waited for someone to come into his room. It didn't occur to him to see if his arms worked and press the call button. Machines all around him kept up a steady buzzing that seemed to drown out his thoughts. After a while, the creaking of the door caught his attention. He blinked when he saw his mom come over next to his bed. "Nathan, are you awake for real?" Lillian touched his cheek as he gave her a weak nod. "I knew you'd come back to us," she said. He wanted to tell her he was going to be fine, but his mouth was still so dry. It took real effort, but he managed to lift his arm and point to the glass of water on the bedside table. An instant relief ran through him when his mom spooned some of the ice chips onto his tongue. One of the nurses came to check on Nathan and found him smiling up at his mother. She grinned as she went about her routine. Satisfied that all the machines were running fine, she left. Lillian talked to Nathan about minor things happening in the world until he fell asleep. Ronald saw his wife standing outside Nathan's room when he got to the hospital and hurried over to her. Tears streaked her cheeks and an instant fear hit him that something bad had happened to Nathan. "Honey, what's wrong?" "Lillian, tell me he's Ronald." They went into his room and watched their son with tears in their eyes. Ronald sat in the corner chair and pulled his wife onto his lap. Nathan woke an hour later to see his parents sleeping. Someday, he hoped to find a true and lasting love like theirs. Ethan walked in and was shocked to see his friends smile at him. His exuberant greeting woke Nathan's parents. They all began talking at once in their excitement over the change in his condition. Ethan told them how he proposed the night before to his girlfriend, Kendra. "So when's the wedding?" Lillian asked. "That all depends on my best man and how long it'll take him to be able to stand up with me," Ethan said, looking right at Nathan. Nathan glanced at his best friend and then his parents. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Lillian noticed his struggle and grabbed a calendar from her purse. "This should help," she told him with a wink. She pointed out the current month and gave a vague timeline for physical therapy according to what the doctor predicted. Nathan shook his head and whispered, "Now." Lillian turned the page ahead, but he put his hand out to stop her. "Back," he said in a raspy voice. "I'll be ready before then." Lillian knew he meant it and she believed it. "Yes, you will." Jared returned to the police station and went right to his office. A quick check of the fax machine brought a triumphant smile. Several calls later, he had the warrant he needed. He assembled his officers and told them what was going on. It didn't take long before they were on their way across town. William crammed the last of the greasy pizza into his mouth and wiped his hands on the front of his shirt. He washed it down with a swig of beer and belched just as the doorbell rang. "Damn kids, probably selling stuff again," he muttered and kicked aside an empty beer can. He jerked open the door, ready to holler at whoever stood on the other side. Seeing Jared Nolan and several police officers stopped him. "William Bloomfield, I have a warrant for your arrest," Jared said in place of a greeting. William felt his world come crashing down at that moment and didn't continue. Jared read him his rights as one of the men put handcuffs on his pudgy wrists. William heard the list of charges and blanched. He'd never survive in prison, and he knew it. A sharp pain in his chest doubled him over, and he dropped to the floor. The ambulance pulled away some time later but didn't rush. Jared and his men had tried to revive William with no luck. The assumption was he had a heart attack when they were arresting him. Edna told Emily she had visitors that evening. Jared and Jason were sitting in the living room when she walked in. She looked from one to the other and knew something was wrong. "Is it Nathan?" She couldn't even say the word. "Emily, we went out to arrest William this afternoon. He died without saying anything." "What do you mean?" Emily asked. "It looks like he had a heart attack. We tried to save him, but we couldn't. He was guilty of much more than you thought." "Are you saying he cheated other people out of their property like he did my parents?" "They trusted him when they signed that contract. He lied when he read all the fine print and details to them. They thought he was paying them the full price when all he gave them was a few measly dollars. Maybe my parents didn't do things right, but they never scammed anyone. William Bloomfield stole our home from us so he could put that apartment building up. My parents never got over it. Your parents weren't the only ones he conned. It might take us a while to sort it all out, but he was guilty, Emily. There's proof of that. We know he paid to have the apartment building torched by a guy named Sparky, too," Jared said. "Did you arrest that person?" she asked. "No, we didn't. A girlfriend of his called us this afternoon. She found him dead in his workshop. Bruises on his neck indicate he was choked." Jason saw Emily's hands shaking and went over to sit next to her. He pulled her close so she could absorb his heat as Jared went on. Investigators found the duplicate books in William's office. Years of fraud and deceit filled the pages. He'd gotten greedier over time and hooked up with Sparky. Setting fire to the apartment building showed how little he cared about others. "Emily, when you ran into that building, you sealed William's fate. Suspicions mounted after we found you in there. My guess is he assumed we'd find the old wiring and say it caused the fire so he could collect his insurance money. It's still my fault Nathan was hurt." "Nathan's awake and talking. He remembers the fire and doesn't blame you at all," Jason said. She looked into Jason's eyes and knew he spoke the truth. Her future looked brighter having a man like Jason in it. Final scene, a wedding and a new beginning. Ethan and Nathan stood in front of the chapel as Kendra walked down the aisle. No one looking at the best man would ever guess he'd been in critical condition 8 months earlier. He turned a little and winked at the pretty blonde standing a few rows back. She'd started out as one of his physical therapists but soon became more. The diamond they chose together sparkled on her finger. Emily and Jason held hands in Ridgeway. They had eloped after dating a few months and just discovered Emily was pregnant. She was part of a family again and loved it. Thanks for watching. What would you have done in Emily's place? Let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories. See you next time.